Welcome back, or welcome to the Developer Tribe, a podcast that delves into the process and practice of coaches, educators, and beyond. It's hard to believe that nearly 1 year later we've already had 24 episodes, 2,500 views and listens, and the start of Season 3. When I started the Developer Tribe, one of the core principles was to have as much positive impact on coaches and educators as we could. 11 months in, and not only is today the launch of Season 3, but also opened our very own online space that you can join at thedevelopertribe.mn.co, where we're doing something a little different. We've brought together 12 experts in the fields of sport coaching, youth physical development, sports psychology, physical education, and more to support you in creating your coaching reality. Keep an eye on our social media for more details in the coming days, and hit the links to request an invite and to find out more about our mission to impact 10,000 practitioners this year. As ever, my thanks for your support, for listening, and for being here however you got here. And with that, let's jump in. My guest today is the program leader on sports business and coaching at University Campus of Football Business, UCFB, and incredibly, since 2005, coaching with England Lacrosse, leading the team as head coach from 2015 and to a European Championship gold medal in Budapest in 2016. He has worked in a wide range of sporting environments, including for Greater Sport and British Basketball, and supported national events such as the London 2012 Olympics, the Glasgow Commonwealth Games, and directed 4 major world championships in multiple sports. It's pretty clear, therefore, that he brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to us that I'm excited to delve into today. We welcome Tom Wenham to the pod.
Thank you very much for that, Tim. That's I like the sound of that when it's read out like that. To be honest, I'm not quite so sure that it's as grand as it sounds in reality, but appreciate the introduction.
I think sometimes when we've been involved in sport for such a long time, and obviously your experience pales mine, but sometimes looking back like that, we can forget just how much we've achieved.
Quite possibly, it may well just be a byproduct, as you kind of politely point out. I've been around for a while, so that's that may be an element that's involved as well, I would guess.
Well, sure. I mean, look, if we didn't catch that in the intro, it's pretty fair to say that lacrosse is central to your sporting life and then indeed your professional career. So how did you get involved in a sport that doesn't really have a traditional grounding here in Britain?
No, very, very much a niche sport, and very much a sport with its origins in North America, and therefore a sport that very much, in terms of profile, number of players, performance levels, is still very much North American centric. They're the only part of the world to have professional leagues, for sure, which is of interest to me, working at the performance end of the sport in particular. But I got involved through school. My school was rugby orientated, very much rugby orientated. I played rugby. I was quite tall for my age when I got there in what was first year then? Is it year 8 now that they start secondary school? And I played rugby because I was big, and the PE teachers pulled me to one side and said, "Right, you'll do for us," kind of thing. But I just got outpaced very, very quickly, and realised that rugby wasn't for me. And luckily, a maths teacher at the school happened to have played lacrosse for England previously, and managed and organised a lacrosse team. It wasn't, therefore, if I'm completely honest, at the start, a positive choice. It was simply to get out of playing rugby, which was very quickly too physical for me, as I say. But found myself falling in love with lacrosse very quickly, and strangely enough, really, really relishing the physical side of the sport, and ended up playing defence, which I guess probably does take you more into some of the contact situations that lacrosse can provide. And my history, passion, involvement in the game has never dwindled, never waned. I've played, then coached, and been involved at all sorts of different levels to this day.
What is it about the sport that interests you so much? I mean, and maybe during your answer, you can tell us, the listeners, and definitely me, a bit more about how the sport actually operates.
Yeah. Um, so lacrosse is history, as I say, is North American. It is a game that was developed by indigenous tribes in North America and had a number of different versions and a number of different purposes, but still has significant cultural. Uh, it really resonates culturally with indigenous North American uh, North American people, and they saw it as a way of settling disputes, as potentially developing their young men for battle, or a way of getting the energy out of young men so they didn't end up going to battle. And the game was, I guess, sort of codified and provided with rules from those original days to what we have now. It's a number of different versions, but broadly speaking, field lacrosse, which is the lacrosse most people will be aware of if they've seen it, and certainly what I played. 10-a-side, 23-man squads in men's lacrosse. You substitute like ice hockey, on and off on the fly. You don't have to wait for a break in play. And because of that, it's a very fast paced game. It's up and down. And in terms of its look, I guess, and its physicality, I think ice hockey is a reasonable transfer. It's in that it's you can go behind the goal, and there aren't many sports where you can play behind goal, but you can in lacrosse, obviously in ice hockey. And we wear the same kind of equipment or very similar equipment to an ice hockey player: helmet, gloves, pads to a certain extent. And that's because takeouts are allowed. It, you don't often see that sort of huge bruising hit, and I wouldn't certainly say that we're nearly as physical as some of the modern rugby is. And the idea is simply to pass a ball from a stick with a net on the end for those who haven't seen it at all, and to move the ball and score in the opposition goal. And the aim of the game at the other end is to stop the opposition scoring. And it's therefore a team invasion sport. And what I've enjoyed about it is its real marriage, I think, of a number of different elements. That there is that physical side to it, but indescribably skillful. It is very, very fast, or it certainly can be fast, and real option and or opportunity for creativity, for doing things a little bit differently. And we frequently see in lacrosse people moving the game forward by trying something new, trying something different. And because of that, I guess there are elements of it that are, which might be interesting when we talk about coach development, elements that are quite player led. You know, players can come up with new ways of solving the problems that the game presents. You've got to beat your man. That's, you know, an invasion game. You've got to find a way of getting past someone. And because they can knock you to the ground, or they can hit your stick with their stick to dislodge the ball, you've got to find ways of protecting your stick, protecting yourself. Maybe it makes more sense to pass the ball and to cut into space. So we might start to see some elements that look a little bit more like basketball, a little bit more off-ball play. It might be that you have a physical matchup that you're confident with. It might be that you have speed or real agility, and you can use that. And I think that therefore those links with basketball are relevant from another perspective, which is something else I enjoy about the sport. Everyone can play it. You can be big and less agile and be enormously effective. You can be small and agile, quick, and rely on those particular skills. It isn't something I would say that necessarily, you know, kind of pigeonholes you, or it requires you to be a particular type of person, a typical type of physical specimen, a typical type of player. You can find what works for you, and that's always appealed to me, that level of creativity that's involved in it.
It sounds like there's a way for all players in the game to find their own qualitative superiority, you know, a way of imposing themselves on the game. And you spoke about some of the creativity that has moved the game forwards at times. Could you give us an example of something that has been relatively new, that has maybe accelerated the game?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'll certainly talk about some of the new things because it's particular interest of mine and particular research interest as well. But I think if I ask that question, what I first go back to is a really formative image that I remember from my era. When I was playing, the level of coverage wasn't the same, and so I'm talking 1990s now. The level of coverage wasn't the same. If you wanted to watch a really good quality game, you had to watch an American game, and that meant getting a VHS tape and all of the challenges that gives. And there are a generation now who just wouldn't recognize that. You go on YouTube and you watch the clips of whatever sport floats your boat. Well, we couldn't do that in my day. And we heard a story of a pair of American twins, Canadian twins, sorry, but playing in America. And one of them jumped over the back of the goal. Now, I need to give a little bit of context to that. The goal is 6 foot by 6 foot. The goalkeeper is protected by a circle that surrounds the goal, and that is called the crease. And no attacking players are allowed inside the crease. That is the rule. And so the sort of accepted wisdom at the time was that you would shoot from distance and that you maybe try and move the goalkeeper. You might try and fake the goalkeeper, but that you would shoot from distance. But one of these Canadian twins, Gary Gay, famously worked out that if he set off from outside this circle, he hadn't broken any rules, he wasn't inside the circle, he jumped from outside it and shot the ball, and the ball went into the goal before he landed, it would count. And he chose to do that from behind the goal. Now, for a non-lacrosse audience, hard to imagine, but I would guess that most people could probably get a vision of what it would look like to try and score a goal from behind in ice hockey. I know that you sometimes see players who shoot from behind the backboard in basketball, you know, those kind of real highlight reel stuff. And it was just that. And it was a player who understood the rules of the game, understood what he was permitted and able to do within those rules, had a performance problem. The problem was, how do I get the ball in the goal? And came up with a solution. And that led to some rule changes. That led to a few people not being enormously happy with that. And over the years, kind of, there is that little bit of backwards and forwards. Well, what can I do within the rules of the game? So bringing it to a more modern era, I would suggest that a parallel that might resonate with people is that what I think we're seeing now is what 2020 is to test match cricket. We are seeing an explosion in new ways of solving old problems. You know, cricket, I hit the ball, I try not to get bowled, I try not to get caught, and I try to score as many runs as I can, be that boundaries or running between the wickets. But we're seeing ramp shots, we're seeing reverse sweeps, we're seeing dill scoops, lots of different ways, which translates sometimes in certain contexts and certain situations into test cricket. And it's that in lacrosse, and why I say it comes back to my own research. I'm particularly interested in shooting and how people finish and put the ball in the back of the net, is how players have come up with new ways of doing that and really challenge some of mine, and I'd argue with probably other people within the lacrosse community as well, your understanding of technique, your understanding of kind of, you know, what the textbook says. This is the right way of doing it. And players are challenging that. Players are finding different ways of doing it. And I guess in some respects leaves us as coaches maybe playing catch up. And I think that's probably something else I enjoy about the sport. I coach now. I love coaching. That's what I get a real kick out of. But I think it's absolutely fabulous that players are finding new ways of solving old and existing problems.
I mean, that is fascinating. And from my perspective, you know, my environment is largely football, and there are these arguments that are being had between football coaches, coach developers, football fans, even, of, how do we develop creativity whilst also supporting the technical development and tactical development of young players. And I always liken it back to, there was a club that I was nearby. I wasn't involved in them, but I was nearby, and their philosophy was very much around 1v1 dominance, particularly at the younger age groups, foundation phase. And they had some fabulously creative players as a result of that, because they'd spent just a huge amount of time of saying, you need to find a way to beat your man, and allowed them to make the mistakes that are necessary to have that creativity come to fruition. What had then been found was that sort of 2 years later, they're playing in a much more open 11-a-side game, and that they hadn't had chance to develop the more passing possession side of the game. So they were playing catch up in that. Now, you might think that that's a relevant trade-off to have or not, but there's definitely a question here in terms of coach development. How do we support coaches in providing an environment whereby innovation can happen, led by the players?
It's a fabulous question, isn't it, Tim? Because it's a really challenging dilemma. We're all products of our own playing backgrounds, our own coach development experiences, and frequently fall back on, well, this is the way I was taught, this is the way it's always been done. And I do, I completely see where you're coming from. It creates a number of challenges of how we support those coaches. I think that I see parallels. If we're going to create environments where we're encouraging players to experiment, where we are suggesting that failure in a practice environment is actually an opportunity, and an opportunity for exploration, an opportunity for experimentation, and then a period of reflection and hopefully some kind of development, skill acquisition, and so on. It strikes me that it makes a lot of sense to create a very similar environment for coaches, and that coaches can experiment, coaches can try different things. And I know from my personal point of view, to use that word again, I think that then the real strength and the ability to reflect on that, to be a reflective practitioner, to truly understand, well, why did that work in that situation? Why did player X respond in this way when we created this practice environment, but player Y responded in a very different way? And what is it that I'm doing that's impacting on the player's development? And allowing coaches to have the space and time to do that. Now, that becomes increasingly challenging, I would suggest, in some of the environments I've worked in, performance environments where, unfortunately, you are assessed on medals and tournament finishing positions and all of that kind of stuff. And it then makes it very difficult to create that kind of environment, but almost sort of psychological safety for players to try new things. Well, why not a little bit of psychological safety for coaches to do that? It's certainly something that we're trying to do with the England Academy, as well as working now with the GB team, which is elite senior men. I also work with the under-15 boys academy. And in lacrosse, under-15 is the first time we see talented young players at a national level. It's the first time they come together. We don't pick them up before then for a number of different reasons, but see them at under 15, and then there's a group of coaches who work with them. So we might have 40 to 50 odd young players, and then a group of 5 or 6 coaches working with them. And we're certainly trying to create that environment where players and coaches can experiment and practice, even at under 15, becomes a collaborative endeavor, a sort of a co-creation endeavor. And I must admit, I don't think we're probably quite there yet. I think it probably is a little bit more more coach-led than I would ideally like. But it's certainly something that we're aspiring towards, and time will tell, I guess. Proof in the pudding and all that. The other difficulty, and why I'm very cognizant of the challenges involved is the coaching process is not one where you can measure results at that level, tactical creativity, say, in anything like days or weeks. We're talking a long-term process, and I'm frequently saying to our academy coaches and to the other people that I work with that we're not likely to see genuine, tangible outcomes from this process until possibly these 14, 15-year-old lads play for the senior England team, which might not be for 10 years' time. So how on earth we're measuring any kind of cause and effect in that scenario, I don't really know. But yeah, throws up a number of different dilemmas for us to try and get our heads around.
And as you say, that is one of the major dilemmas, isn't it? If we are taking a more non-linear approach or a non-linear underpinning to what we do in order to provide players with this psychological safety, in order to have creativity and so on. As you say, you know, as coaches, we might not actually see the fruits of our labor for a long time, or indeed maybe even at all. You may change club, you might work with different players, you might not actually be around when that happens. So it takes a great deal of stubbornness, I think, and bravery on the part of the coach to operate in that way.
I agree. I completely agree, Tim. What I've taken a lot of comfort and solace in is being able to base it on some kind of evidence-based approach, though. I take all of that. But if I was coming in and saying to the assistant coach I work with, right, this is what we're doing because I think it's a good idea, or my opinion is somehow of greater value than anyone else's, I'd feel deeply uncomfortable. What I've really taken, as I say, great comfort from is doing my MSc, did it at Leeds Beckett, loved the process, the journey, the actual kind of nuts and bolts of a deep dive into some of the theoretical principles that underpin coaching practice, and then trying to contextualize that to my own coaching, and trying to contextualize that to that kind of link between theory and practice to the specifics of, in this example, the under 15 boys academy. And why I say that's given me great comfort is that I've then got something I can challenge. I've then got something I can pin it on. It's not fad. It's not, it's not opinion. It's not even, I guess, arguably subjective. Although I know enough about the coaching process that we're not. It's not engineering we're discussing here. So there's always going to be that element of subjectivity, but I've at least got something that I can pin it on, and then I have got something that I can be challenged on, or that other people can challenge me on. Maybe something that we can link to elements of existing research, existing literature, and that then gives us an evidence-based underpinning that we can contextualize and adapt in a way that best suits us. And as I say, that now is giving me great comfort, and I feel like that gives us a fairly solid foundation. I'll be completely honest and say the journey hasn't always been like that. That you reach a stage as a coach, or I certainly did, when you kind of have this dawning realization of all the things that you don't know and all the things that you don't understand. And you've heard somebody talking about ecological dynamics, and it's like, oh my God, how on earth am I going to get my head around that? Non-linear pedagogy, what on earth are we on about here? This is just nuts stuff. And that actually, I would argue my coaching practice dipped significantly, probably for a good couple of years, because I was just second guessing. I was just kind of questioning myself all the time. I was disappearing down these spirals, these little rabbit holes. But feeling like I've come out the other side, I do now feel there is significant benefit in being able to underpin my coaching with a relevant application of relevant theories, and having enough breadth and depth to my knowledge to be able to critically evaluate that and put in place what best works for us. And then if it isn't working for us, to have a robust enough reflective and evaluative process in place to make the changes.
And I think that points again to what you were saying earlier of we need a situation where coaches at all levels can feel like they can have those times, those windows. I mean, you mentioned a couple of years there, but for all of us, it's ups and downs and it's troughs, and they last for short, longer periods, whatever. Especially if we are being quite critical of our own practice. But we need a situation, an environment where that's okay, that it's possible to do that. Otherwise, yeah, we are going to put ourselves under this incredible pressure that, every session has to be on point. Every practice has to be, optimal. And of course, that's what we're aiming for. But no less than what we understand of our player development and offering them that environment, we have to do the same for ourselves. And I would argue that some of that is probably down to self-awareness. What else can we do you think, in terms of clubs, organizations? What's the support network? What's the environment we can put around coaches to allow them to have those experiences?
I think it's a really, well, it is an excellent question, because like all the excellent questions, I don't think there are any easy answers, and there's certainly no taking a reductive process to it and saying, well, look, these are the three things that are really going to count, is a real challenge. I think if I was, feet to the fire and came up with one thing that I think has helped me, is a real mutual clarity of expectation. And I use the word mutual because in my coaching context, I think there are a lot of stakeholders. If I take the under 15 boys academy, obviously the boys themselves and the coaches working with them, but you've then got a wider support network. You've got parents, guardians, and so on. And you've then got their clubs that they come from. They're obviously coming to us as a national England academy, but they've got their home clubs who want to see them develop and grow and improve. And you've also got stakeholders within the game, the level of expectation of that these boys will progress on to the under 17 academy, that they may well lacrosse, as we start having recognised international competition at under 19, under 20. So that there will then be some element of talent ID for those boys, not that long after they leave us. So there's other stakeholders. Are you producing players who are going to help us win world championships? So all of these different, and in some cases overlapping, but in some cases competing expectations need to be understood, need to be managed. I would argue need to be clarified. And I think that creates an environment where not only the coaches, which was your question, but I think also the other stakeholders understand their roles and responsibilities in that. They understand. You can start to then unpick, well, what does success look like for us? What does good look like for us? And you then maybe can start to see that as a more holistic process in and of itself. I think if we're going to say, and I completely agree with your point, there's an enormous amount of expectation on coaches themselves. I would think it helps if I'm not in this alone. This is now a collaborative process. I'm now working with parents to try and make this happen. I'm now engaging with host clubs who take responsibility for making this happen. And, it's not all the weight on my shoulders. I think, or I'd like to think, as well as expectation, is maybe providing specific roles and responsibilities to take pressure off coaches. And I say that because I very much see that as part of my role. I'm head coach of the academy, and I step out onto the turf and I, work with the boys. That's a love of mine, and a love that I'm pretty confident I will never lose. But the reality is the other coaches who are there with me are the ones who are working directly and implementing whatever plan, whatever coaching activity it is that we've agreed on for that particular session. So then my role maybe does specifically come to be an interface with parents, to pick up on specific individual issues with players, which would maybe otherwise become a distraction or a burden to the coaches, to report to those further up the food chain in terms of the talent development process, the the understanding of performance and all of that kind of stuff. And my role then is to sort of shape and create that environment and hopefully take some of the burden away from them and give them the opportunity to feel safe, to be creative, to be innovative in their own coaching, to experiment, all those words we used before.
That's so valuable, Tom. The knowledge that you are part of a wider system is valuable, I think, is really valuable and perhaps even crucial. And I wonder if sometimes the language used of centeredness, although I don't know if there's really another way of putting this, that language of centeredness, whether it's athlete, coach, whatever, it does fail sometimes to really acknowledge there is this wider talent development environment going on. And I'm just a part of that, a very important part, but I am just part nonetheless. And if I can position myself that way, then my work takes on a completely different conceptualization straight away.
I think that's a great way of putting it, Tim, isn't it? A different conceptualization of what my role might be. And don't get me wrong, I think that is challenging for some coaches, because some coaches certainly come into that environment seeing themselves as, well, I need to add value by solving problems. I need to add value by spotting the technical error and talking directly to the player and giving them solutions on how to solve it. I see myself as I need to get things done quickly. So the quickest way of doing that is telling little Johnny or little Joey the best way, whatever my idea of what the best way is. And I do think that some coaches do still see coaching in that way. That's certainly some parents maybe see it as a transactional relationship. I just as a bit of an aside, but I have been told before now by someone within the game, I expect to see you doing more coaching. And I knew exactly what they meant. I expect to see you doing more shouting, more talking, more stop and stand still. And this is how we all do it. Here's the demonstration by me because I'm the expert and I know what I'm doing. And so I think that if we start to change, as you put it, our conceptualization of what coaching is, of what the coaching process is, that it becomes a more holistic affair, that it does have the athlete at the center and the coach is an element of that, and hopefully a very significant element of that, but not the be all and end all, not the sage on the stage who has to solve every problems out there. And I think that then, like I say, that why I say I think establishing expectations early is so important, that then everyone understands that as well. Parents, okay, well, I now know what my role is and what I play in this. And the reality, and this is just my anecdotal feeling in lacrosse, but I have said this to our parents, and I will say it again once we're allowed to get back coaching. The parents will play a far, far bigger role in the development of these young lads than I and the other coaches ever will. We're not even going to scratch the surface. So for us to understand that is really important, but for the parents to understand that is really important. And you can then have hopefully a more positive, collaborative process where everybody feels that they're invested in it and can do what their role dictates, determines to the best of their ability, and accept that that's not always going to be consistent, because, as you rightly point out, peaks and troughs, and to be on it all the time is simply exhausting. I have been there, done it, coached England to a World Championships in 2018 and was, struggled afterwards. It was tough. Really reminded of a line that I think was from The Hobbit: too little butter spread over too much bread. I just felt drained. I just felt this is too much for me to deal with, and appreciate that that's not healthy. I can't give it my best when I'm feeling like that, and I've no doubt didn't. So to create an environment where we are we're sharing burden with clear expectations seems a little bit healthier to me.
Yeah, and that cycles me back to what I wanted to cycle back to with you. Of, you spoke about the co-construction of practice, or an environment where there is a bit more co-construction of practice going on with players. And there's an interesting study a few years back that I came across that was conducted in Norway, and they researched a group of coaches who applied a process that was more of a games-based approach. But the reason I'm bringing that up is that it was more of a co-constructed approach, regardless of what the paradigm was. And that those coaches reported higher levels of well-being at the end of the season than the other group of coaches. And indeed, on reflection, between how they felt at the end of the previous season. And so regardless of whether it was successful for the players or whatever, what it was clearly stating, and haven't really seen any further research along this lines, what it was stating was that those coaches, via a less coach-centered approach, were actually having higher senses of well-being across the course of this season. And I just thought that was a really interesting finding. But for our conversation here, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what co-construction looks like on field in practice.
Yeah. Well, game based is the starting point. To pick up on what you mentioned there. Not aware of that study, by the way, but that's fabulous. And I anecdotally, I could absolutely feel that. I think there's lots of things that goes into a very, very sort of tell-style, autocratic, coach-centered environment. Things around kind of ego and whatever else. But if you kind of can give that up and become more holistic in your approach, I can absolutely see that explicitly and measurably impacting on your own well-being. But anyway, back to your question. So in terms of what a training session would look like, I would say are fundamentally games-based and very much work on a principle of representative learning design, that our practices look like elements of the game. We tend to split the boys into 4 teams, and each team has a coach with them. But we then try and frame that coach with as a facilitator, really, rather than a coach. We're running practices. So ours is kind of camp orientated because it's a talent academy. So they'll come to us, say, for a whole Sunday, and a whole Sunday will be 10 till 4, something like that. So we've got an element of warm up, practice before lunch, which might give us a chance for a little bit of review, reflection, feedback, feed forwards, and then into the afternoon session. So that's kind of structurally what it looks like with these groups of maybe 10 to 12 boys. Each have got a coach with them. But then when we're getting into our games-based practices, we might give the boys particular scenarios to work through. And they come up with, so let's say we're playing a small-sided game, we're playing a 4v4 game, that we'll give them a constraint or a challenge, or we might term it differently. We might give them a superpower. Every goal you score with your lacrosse is a game that's traditionally played right-handed and left-handed. To be ambidextrous is helpful. So we might say every goal that you score with your left hand, so the equivalent of saying to a right-footed football player, every goal you score with your left foot counts double. If every player on your team scores a goal, you get an extra 5 points. We'll put something in that just sort of changes the dynamic, that gives them something to think through tactically. You talked about tactical creativity before, but and those who are into cards, obviously becoming big in coaching now. There's plenty of versions knocking about, and we've created our own so players can draw cards. So it's maybe even not necessarily the coach stipulating what the players have got to do. They might have a little bit of autonomy. They might have a bit of choice, bit of self-determination going on, them kind of working out what's best for them as a team. But then, importantly, some of the elements that we've stolen from elsewhere, not saying there's anything that we do that's particularly different or special, is that the players will have time to discuss beforehand. Okay, we know what our superpower is, or we know what area of the pitch we can't go into, or we know which players we want to score goals, or we know what element of the opposition's play we want to shut down to gain our extra points, to maximize our superpower. How are we going to do it? And then the coach's role is to make sure that all voices are heard, that everybody has an opportunity to chip into that. It's not simply the most confident or the loudest players who are dominating conversations. And it might be over time that coaches are then using that to even challenge those players at an individual level. Okay, Johnny, we heard a lot from you last session. Why don't you? Personal challenge for you this time round is to try and, I want you to feed back the views from 3 of the other players. You can start to sort of manipulate constraints within constraints and really have that understanding of the person as opposed to just seeing them as the athlete. So the players have that opportunity to discuss what are our tactics, what are we going to do, and then we'll frequently give them timeouts, but they're player timeouts. It's for them to decide, and we do that because they've had their conversation, they've worked out what they're going to do, they start the game, they're all buzzing, they've got their plan, and let's say it doesn't go to plan. Well, then they need to be able to review that, to read that. Well, it isn't working. Why is it not working? Again, an opportunity for them to question and answer each other, to share thoughts, developing their reflective practice. So you've almost got this sort of implicit development of some of the skills that we want to see in our elite level lacrosse players. This tactical understanding, what we call lacrosse IQ, this ability to review and reflect quickly. Lacrosse, an elite level game, lasts for 80 minutes, but like I said, it's fast paced. So what are the opposition doing? How do we react? How do we change our tactics? So give the players for opportunities for timeouts, and then review and reflection at the end. And we might do that with multiple different changes. We might give one player within a particular team a totally separate challenge, and use that as a way of differentiating, of challenging different athletes, different players in different ways, and may well not be anything to do with that sort of traditional tech stuff. It might be that we're encouraging less vocal players to be more vocal. It might be that we're making captain one player who has that quiet leadership but hasn't yet kind of stepped up in front of his peers. And then within that entire process and that review and reflection post is then an opportunity to implement again. So we're we're trying to look to layer this. Well, what would you do differently next time? Okay, well, what you can start to get into some conversations, and I'm sure a lot of your podcast listeners have come across Mark Bennett and a number of podcasts that he's done, and players feeding back to each other, that communication between themselves, challenging themselves before they even think of communicating with the coach, and trying to make that second nature. And it's almost, as I say, this ability to develop their tactical creativity, to develop their problem-solving skills on the hoof. And I do like the idea that by reflecting on action, by reflecting after the fact, you can then improve your decision-making when you're in it. Okay, well, we talked about this. We had that conversation about this scenario. We discussed that we might try this, and we thought this might come up. And my hope would be that you've then got to come back to your question about collaboration. The coach is sort of establishing a broad training framework, some kind of games, whatever they might be, but it's the players who are deciding what that looks like for them at an individual level, and not only deciding what that looks like for them at an individual and team level, deciding what good looks like, and deciding whether they've got close to good, and if they have got close to good, why they got close to good. If they haven't got close to good, why not, and what they should do differently next time round. And that real idea of ownership a real clear understanding of what works for them in that particular context and why. And look, I'm kind of painting a picture of that, Tim. That's the answer to your question around collaboration. I'm not so sure that it's always as idealized as that. There will still be times when, as a coach, you're like, I've got to step in here. I've got to say something. I've got to do a stop and stand still. Come on, let's just, you and maybe you bite your tongue and you fight that and you move on. But maybe sometimes you don't, and there's still are a little bit elements that are a bit more instructional in nature. But that's maybe one example of certainly something that we've been playing around with as in terms of format and structures for sessions.
It was a wide question, and you've given a wide but very detailed answer, and really appreciate that. And I think that one of the things that I wrote down whilst you were talking there is that if we are going to deliver in a co-collaborative, co-constructed way, using a games-based approach, if we're doing that and putting that in place, it's not a case of, hey, here's some conditions and go, just leaving them to it. We are complicit. And I think that there has been, and I've spoken about this at great length before, of it doesn't mean abdicating your role as coach. It is genuinely a co-collaboration rather than just something we are providing. And I think that sometimes that message has gotten lost a little bit in either the literature or the education of coaches over time. That the way that I like to conceptualize it now is, can we provide an environment where they get to announce things for themselves? And sometimes that can literally be out loud. But as we well know, sometimes that's just by experiencing it. You can see that they've had this learning opportunity and it's resonated with them without necessarily having said anything about it. And we don't really perhaps need to comment on that as a coach. Maybe we do it later.
Yeah, no, that is a really nice way of summarizing it. I think what this isn't too tautological, what is implied in what you're saying there is a level of implicit learning by the players, and I'm kind of aware of the potential power and benefits of that as well, that they're just kind of taking things in and finding their own solutions, but implicitly there's no need for that kind of explicit instruction from coaches. But what within what you're saying there, Tim, I couldn't agree more about some of the challenges for coaches and understanding what that kind of approach means, and that phrase used of abdicating responsibility. I think one of the really dangerous phrases that seems to have percolated some elements is let the game be the teacher. And I know what people mean by that, and I think it's often said very well meaning, but yeah, simply playing games isn't really what I'm getting at. This is a more, hopefully, sophisticated manipulation of various performance, individual task constraints to help players best understand the performance environment and best try and find their own solutions. And to do that, maybe we're going to really hammer home this co-collaboration stuff, is to understand what solutions are best for me as an individual, as a player, but actually how does that then impact on the other people in the team, and really do I need to adapt my game to best support the people I'm playing alongside, my mates who I'm playing alongside, and yeah, you kind of get into a whole level of complexity, but I completely agree that we're not simply just saying, here's a couple of goals, here's a ball, and just go out and see what happens. Though that said, we do that, but we do tend to do that more as the warm-up. Our warm-ups hopefully look a little bit like a little bit like football used to look on the halcyon cobbled streets. It is that sort of street ball vibe we try and get into some of our warm-ups. But yeah, I think your point's a really valid one. And then maybe bringing it back to coach development is how do we best support coaches to understand review, reflect on, analyze those subtle manipulations of constraint, of task, environment, of the individual, and all of that kind of stuff. And that, yeah, I don't think that is easy, and it's definitely not as easy as let's just go and play some games and hope that we get better, or whatever it is that we want to get better at.
You've left us with a lot to chew on, and I'm quite tempted to leave that particular part there, because I think that's plenty. I mean, I'm looking forward to listening back to this one already. I really wanted to ask you, given just how central you are to this sport in England, what does the next few years look like for lacrosse?
Hopefully, Tim, enormously exciting. We have seen huge changes at World Federation level. I mean, I think the last men's World Championship was 40, not far off 50 teams, which is, an enormous explosion in lacrosse terms, because when I was playing for England, there was kind of, 6 teams at World Championships, and now it's genuinely a global sport. And so at world level, that's given maybe a little bit more profile internationally. That has attracted funding and enabled the world governing body to look at a genuine bid for Olympic inclusion. And we are hopeful as a sport of being at least a demonstration sport by 2028. 2028 Olympics is Los Angeles. It's a North American game, so there's a natural fit there. Los Angeles is now going to be hosting the men's field championships before then, so an opportunity for all of the relevant sports politics to be played out by whoever needs to play it out. And the International Federation have worked very closely with the IOC to get an understanding of what version of lacrosse might best go into the Olympics. And because the Olympics now have caps on participant numbers, as opposed to kind of sports and any other criteria you might put in place, there's not a chance that full field lacrosse would get in. As I said before, that's 10 players on the field. That's 23-man squads, and you've then got all of your support staff that go into that. Certainly the last World Championships, the England men's team, we went with a touring party that was 32, I think, in total. Well, times that by 40, however many countries in the world will play at the Olympics. The IOC just aren't going to buy it. So the World Federation have used their funding, used their resources to develop a new version of the game, 6-a-side, and to then have a smaller, sort of condensed, I guess TV friendly, if we're being completely honest, version of the game that hopefully will appeal to the IOC. To give it context to other people from other sports, think 2020 to Test cricket, think rugby sevens to the 15-a-side game, and that's what the Olympic rules will be for lacrosse, is the 6-a-side version. And part of the pathway, final part to your question, the part of the pathway to get to the Olympics is World Games, and lacrosse will be at the World Games. Next one is Birmingham, Alabama, and the World Games, for those who haven't come across it, is a multi-sport event which sits just below the Olympics for all those sports who aspire to be in the Olympics. A number of martial arts, squash, those sort of sports that are in there and want to take that step for Olympic inclusion, and lacrosse is now on the programme for the World Games. So we're moving in the right direction. The right conversations seem to be being had. I think the feeling is that lacrosse's inclusion in the Olympics is moved from being possible to probable, but maybe, still not perhaps likely, but, we're definitely moving in the right direction. And as anyone who's listening, UK audience will know, if lacrosse got to Olympic inclusion, that's just an enormous game changer at all sorts of different levels. in terms of resources, profile, funding, support, just a whole raft of different things come into play then. So certainly something that very excited and hoping that we're moving in the right direction. So I'd like to think that the next few years for lacrosse are pretty exciting, Tim, to be honest.
It does sound exciting, and you can hear, I'm sure the listeners can as well, you can hear the passion that you have for the sport. Clearly an ambassador for the sport, never mind lacrosse just in England. So really fingers crossed that lacrosse is more involved at that higher level of stage in the near future. Thank you so much for your time on all of this, Tom. I've really enjoyed that conversation. I do have one last question for you, which is, if you could have an audience with just one person, who would you choose?
What a great question. An audience with one person. I think, look, it would depend on whether I thought my audience would get me anywhere. But I think that if lacrosse is to have a real foothold in English sport, in British sport, it needs to be not necessarily on the curriculum, but provided within secondary schools on a more consistent basis. So if I kind of thought that Gavin Williamson had any kind of clout in that direction and could make that change, he would be the person who I would be interested in sitting down and having a one-to-one with, and seeing if I couldn't sell him on the idea. But as I say, I'm not necessarily convinced that audience would get me anywhere. But that's maybe that broader question of what outcome would I want from any audience, I think, is to try and see lacrosse more embedded as a school sport, particularly at secondary school level. That would be an enormous change for us as well. We're certainly not there at the moment. We're certainly not there on the boys' side in particular. I mean, girls lacrosse is very, very successful, certainly in the independent sector, but boys lacrosse not so at the moment. So yeah, any audience you can set up, Tim, that helps me move the sport forward in that way, I'll bite your hand off.
Yeah, I don't quite have that power yet, but it's interesting that your dedication to the sport, even in that question, comes out. You had the choice of literally anyone there, and you've gone for something that would push the sport in a positive direction. So I think that speaks volumes. Thanks again for your time. If anyone wanted to reach out to you, Tom, what would be the best way?
I'm not great on social media, if I'm honest, but I am becoming, I'm an avid Twitter lurker. I don't know whether that's the right way of putting it. That sounds slightly inappropriate, but I try to follow a number of people on Twitter, just because I find people who have arguments I find are engaging, and so I am on Twitter. I'm just at Tom Wenham, and I guess hopefully easy enough to find on there. And would certainly be interested in connecting with people and chatting more. And as you say, taking on that ambassadorial role is not one that I've ever formally been given, but I'm always happy to chat to people about coaching, about performance sport, talent development, and obviously lacrosse as a whole.
Well, informally then, very happy to bestow that upon you. And again, just lastly, thanks again for your time. Awesome conversation. One I really look forward to coming back to, and it just leaves me to say welcome to the tribe.
Absolute pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thanks very much, Tim.
Wow, what a start. A huge thank you to Tom for taking us through his experience and insight today. If you've enjoyed this, please do let us know what you're taking away from the episode. And if you could ask Tom a question, what would that be? And in fact, if you wanted to get some time with Tom to ask those questions, you now can, as Tom is one of the 12 mentors in our multiple mentor network that you could access via our online space at thedevelopertribe.mn.co, where we're doing coach and teacher education a little bit differently. Interested individuals and groups can co-create their own roadmap of development with us and target support on a range of topics with the best mentor for that field of expertise. Not only do we have that service available, but we'll be covering coaching and education topics each month with content, webinars, Q&As and more. It's an exciting time, and we hope to welcome you to the tribe soon as part of the 10,000 practitioners we're seeking to impact this year. Don't forget to subscribe to the pod, which will go out every Thursday. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you again soon.